Some interviews end with applause. Some end with laughter, with handshakes, with a polished, "Thank you for joining us," and a cut to commercial. And then there are the ones that end with security being called. The ones that end with a man, calm, deliberate, dangerous in the way only truly still people can be, standing up from his chair, looking directly into the lens of a live camera, and saying something that millions of people would replay again and again in the days that followed. This is what happens when you ask for accountability in modern media. Remember this moment. What you are about to witness is not a meltdown. It is not a tantrum. It is not a celebrity losing control. What Tom Hardy did on that morning show set was something far more unsettling to the people in that studio and far more powerful to everyone watching at home. He simply refused to play along. And that refusal shook the walls of Good Morning America to their foundation. To understand what happened that morning, you first have to understand the world Tom Hardy walked into. Morning television is a machine, a precise, relentless, meticulously engineered machine built not just to inform but to entertain, to provoke, to generate moments that people screenshot and share before their coffee has finished brewing. By the time the average viewer sits down with their breakfast and switches on, the studio has already been running for hours. The set is warm. The lighting is calibrated to make everyone look approachable, friendly, safe. The couches are positioned just far enough apart to create intimacy, but not so close as to create discomfort. Everything about morning television is designed to feel like a conversation between friends. It rarely is. George Stephanopoulos is, by any measure, one of the most experienced journalists in American broadcasting, a former White House communications director, a man who has sat across from presidents and prime ministers, dictators and diplomats, a man who understands, perhaps better than most, the power of a question asked at exactly the right moment. And on this particular morning, he had a question ready, several in fact, what Stephanopoulos may not have fully anticipated. What perhaps no one in that studio that morning had fully anticipated was that his guest had questions of his own. Tom Hardy arrived at the studio before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, 5 in the morning, the kind of hour that belongs to bakers and taxi drivers, and apparently to actors willing to promote their latest film on national television. He wore a simple black jacket, no elaborate styling, no carefully curated celebrity armor, just a man dressed plainly, carrying the quiet energy of someone who has spent years studying the human capacity for darkness and emerged from that study not rattled, but certain, certain of what he believes, certain of what he will and will not accept. That certainty, as it turned out, was about to be tested. It began the way these things always begin: a warm welcome, a practiced smile, the kind of handshake that looks natural because it has been performed 10,000 times. "Tom, thanks for joining us this morning." Hardy settled into his chair. His posture was open, his expression neutral. He was there for a purpose: to talk about his new film, the work he had poured himself into, the story he wanted audiences to experience. He was ready for questions about craft, about character, about the particular madness that drives an actor to disappear so completely into a role that the line between fiction and self becomes dangerously thin. What he was not ready for, what no publicist had flagged, no production team had disclosed, was what came next. "Your new film is getting incredible reviews," Stephanopoulos said, "but I want to talk about something else first." And just like that, a door closed. The door marked, "This is what you came here for," swung shut quietly, and another one opened. One Hardy hadn't been told about. You could see it happen in real time. Not anger, not panic, not the wide-eyed scramble of someone blindsided. Just awareness. The kind of awareness that comes when you've spent years inhabiting characters who can read a room in a single breath. When you've trained yourself to notice the smallest shift in another person's energy, the tiniest tremor beneath the surface meant to appear still. Hardy noticed, and he waited. Several mental health advocates have criticized your recent interviews, Stephanopoulos continued, his tone carefully measured, his posture leaning forward with the practiced confidence of a man who believes he holds the upper hand. "They're saying you're glamorizing dangerous behavior." The studio was very quiet. Hardy looked at his host for a long moment, and then he said one word, just one: That would set the tone for everything that followed. Irresponsible. He let it sit in the air. He didn't rush, he didn't deflect. That's an interesting word choice, George. Care to elaborate? Stephanopoulos leaned forward. He framed the question carefully. The way you frame something when you want it to sound like concern but land like an accusation. He talked about parents. He talked about young actors. He invoked the specter of dangerous influence, of irresponsibility, of a celebrity carelessly scattering psychological hazard into the world simply by discussing how he does his job. It was a familiar formula, the kind of question designed to put a guest on the back foot, to make denial look like defensiveness, to make any pushback look like proof of guilt. It had probably worked on 100 guests before. It did not work on Tom Hardy. You agree with them? Hardy asked. His voice had not risen, not even slightly, but something in the texture of it had changed, the way a calm sea changes when you notice that the birds have all gone quiet. I'm asking the questions here, Tom. Then ask them, Hardy might as well have replied, but instead he waited, patient, precise. And when the answer came, when Stephanopoulos laid out his concern about parents, about young actors following Hardy's example, the actor's response arrived not as an explosion, but as something quieter and therefore more devastating. Parents should be concerned, Hardy said slowly, about morning show hosts who do zero research before ambushing their guests with loaded questions based on secondhand gossip. The studio audience didn't move. You could hear the air. Stephanopoulos' smile, that professional, permanently installed expression of approachable authority, flickered. It was barely a moment, a fraction of a second, the kind of thing you'd miss if you blinked. But the cameras caught it. Tom, I don't think that's fair. We're just trying to have an honest conversation. Hardy's response came without hesitation. Honest? George, mate, if you wanted an honest conversation, you would have mentioned this line of questioning to my publicist. You would have done your homework instead of reading talking points off a teleprompter. There it was, the fracture line. Visible now to everyone in the room and to everyone watching at home. This was not going to be a normal interview. What followed was unlike almost anything previously captured on morning television, not because Hardy raised his voice, not because he stormed off or used language that would need to be bleeped in post-production, not because of any of the things that normally qualify as losing it in the tabloid taxonomy of celebrity meltdowns. What made the next several minutes extraordinary was that Tom Hardy did something morning television is specifically designed to prevent. He asked for evidence, simple, basic, foundational evidence. He asked Stephanopoulos, who had just spent several minutes implying that Hardy was a danger to young actors, that he had been publicly criticized by mental health advocates, that concerned parents across the country had reason to worry about his influence, to back up those claims, to cite a specific article, a specific expert, a specific quote word for word in context, and Stephanopoulos could not. Can you cite them for me? Hardy asked. Word for word, the pause that followed lasted only a few seconds on air. It felt like minutes. Stephanopoulos glanced at his notes, looked back at Hardy, looked at the camera, back at Hardy. Well, there have been several interviews where you've discussed your intense preparation methods. Several interviews, Hardy repeated, slowly, deliberately, like a man turning an object over in his hands, examining it from every angle. But you can't quote a single one specifically, can you? You can't tell me which publication, which journalist, which exact words I use that you find so problematic. The silence stretched. Tom, I think we're getting off track here. No, George. And here, for the first time, something shifted in Hardy's voice. Not louder, but harder, like stone where there had been water. I think we're getting right on track. Hardy laid it out with the methodical precision of a man who has spent years preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation, not because he planned for it, but because he simply cannot abide in precision when his integrity is on the line. You've accused me of irresponsibility. Where is the evidence? You've invoked mental health advocates who are supposedly concerned. Name one. You've suggested parents should worry about my influence on young actors. Show me the study. Show me the expert opinion. Show me anything. Each request was calm. Each one was specific. Each one, in turn, was met with the same rotating arsenal of non-answers, several articles, various media outlets. Our research team compiled information, and with each evasion, Hardy named what it was. Weasel words, mate. That's how people talk when they're making things up. Stephanopoulos was sweating now, visibly. The mask, the smooth, authoritative, I've interviewed president's mask, was slipping, and neither of them could stop it. Are not making anything up. Then prove it, right now, on air. There's a moment in every confrontation, the kind waged not with fists, but with words, with silence, with the refusal to flinch. When you can see the exact second one party realizes they have lost, it doesn't happen in an instant. It accumulates. It accumulates in the shuffling of papers that don't contain what you need, in the glances off camera at producers who can't rescue you, in the words that keep changing, sources, articles, research team concerns, various outlets, as you search desperately for something solid to stand on and find, again and again, only sand. For Stephanopoulos, that moment came in waves. The first wave when he couldn't cite a single quote. The second, when Hardy named exactly what he was doing, you sound like a politician dodging a corruption scandal. The third, and perhaps the most cutting, when Hardy turned the lens of responsibility around completely. George, do you realize you're doing exactly what you're accusing me of? You're potentially damaging someone's reputation based on vague, unsubstantiated claims. The fourth wave, when he tried to retreat. Tom, let's talk about your new film. And Hardy held the line. No, George, we're not done here. It was the children question that may have landed hardest. Hardy looked at his host, the man who had spent 10 minutes implying that his professional conduct was a danger to the young and impressionable, and he asked quietly, almost gently, "Do you have children?" "That's not relevant. I think it is." "Do you have children who might see this interview? Children who might learn from watching how you conduct yourself professionally? Because if you do, what lesson do you think they're learning right now? That it's okay to make accusations without evidence? That it's acceptable to ambush people with lies and call it journalism? That when you're caught in your own negligence, you can just ask people to tone it down and move on? The question hung in the air of that studio like smoke. Stephanopoulos had no answer. Not because the question was unfair, but because it was the same question he had started with. What responsibility do people in your position owe to the people watching? Turned completely, devastatingly back on its source. And then, in what may be the single most surreal moment in this entire chapter of television history, Stephanopoulos did something that no one in that room seemed to fully expect. He called security, not because Hardy had raised his voice, not because he had moved from his chair, not because he had threatened anyone or broken anything or done a single thing that could reasonably be called disruptive. He called security because a guest had asked him, repeatedly and calmly, to back up his own questions with facts. Hardy stared at the approaching guards, and then he looked directly into the camera, not at Stephanopoulos, not at the audience, into the lens itself, as if speaking to the millions of people who would watch this moment, that morning, that week, for years afterward. This is what modern journalism has become, folks. When a journalist gets called out for shoddy research and unsubstantiated accusations, they call security instead of admitting their mistakes. One of the guards spoke. "Tom, you need to calm down." Hardy looked at him with something that might have been, in another context, pity. I'm sitting in my chair, speaking in complete sentences, asking for basic journalistic standards. What exactly do I need to calm down from? He stood up slowly, not dramatically, not performatively. He rose the way you rise when you have decided something, when the calculus has been completed and the conclusion is clear, and all that remains is the simple, necessary act of leaving. He did not slam anything. He did not shout. He did not gesture at the cameras or at the audience or at the production team that was surely in full crisis mode by now, somewhere behind the lights. He simply stood, and he spoke, one final time, into the lens. "I came here to talk about my work, and I'm being removed from the set for expecting basic journalistic integrity." A pause. Remember this moment. And he walked off the set under his own power, on his own terms, leaving behind a studio full of silent people, a host visibly trying to reassemble himself from pieces that no longer quite fit together. and a camera that lingered just a few seconds too long on George Stephanopoulos sitting alone in his chair, hands slightly unsteady, shuffling papers that contained the questions for an interview that had already become history. The cut to commercial, when it finally came, was one of the most merciful things anyone in that studio could have done. In the hours and days that followed, the internet did what the internet does. The clip spread. It was clipped and captioned and analyzed from every conceivable angle. Talk shows debated it. Media critics weighed in. Journalists wrote op-eds about journalist accountability, which contained a particular kind of irony that was not lost on observers. Some said Hardy had gone too far, that a guest, however wronged, has an obligation to maintain a certain decorum on another person's set. Some said Stephanopoulos had simply tried to do his job, that asking difficult questions is what journalists are supposed to do. That morning television's charge has never been to coddle its subjects. But most of the people who watch that clip in their kitchens and on their phones and in their offices, seem to feel something simpler. They felt like they had watched someone refuse to be gaslit. And in an era when the average person often feels talked at rather than talked to, when headlines are crafted for outrage rather than accuracy, when various sources say is treated as the journalistic equivalent of established fact, there was something deeply satisfying about watching a man calmly, methodically, and without visible aggression simply say, "Show me the evidence. Provide the quote. Give me a name," and refuse to move until someone did. Tom Hardy has never been the easiest person to interview. He is not by nature a man who performs comfort for an audience. He doesn't offer the easy laugh, the self-deprecating joke designed to make a host look clever, the perfectly assembled soundbite that makes everyone's job easier. He is, instead, a man who takes things seriously, who takes his work seriously, who takes the question of what actors owe to the characters they inhabit, and what characters owe to the audiences who receive them, with a weight that many of his contemporaries simply don't. That seriousness is what made him extraordinary as Bane, as Ronnie Cray, as Venom, as Alfie Solomons, as a dozen other characters who live at the edge of what a human being is capable of, the violence and the grief, and the love and the madness that coexist in the most complex of human hearts. And it is that same seriousness, that same refusal to accept the version of reality someone else is trying to impose on him, that walked him off that set on a morning when most people would have simply absorbed the ambush and moved on. There's a question worth sitting with after all of this. Not whether Hardy was right or wrong, not whether Stephanopoulos intended malice or simply misjudged the man sitting across from him. The question is this: what do we owe each other when we sit across from each other and begin to speak? A journalist owes their subject the dignity of preparation, the respect of actually knowing what they're asking about before they ask it. A subject owes their host the courtesy of engagement, of patience, of a willingness to be questioned. But there is a threshold, a line, thin but real, between the question asked in good faith and the question designed to wound, between the pursuit of truth and the manufacture of content. When that line is crossed, most people look down at their hands and wait for the commercial break. Tom Hardy looked up. He looked directly into the cameras that carry the image of who we are to millions of people who are trying to understand the world, and he said simply, "This isn't good enough. I expect better. You should too. Whether you agree with how he handled it or not, whether you think he went too far or not far enough, or exactly as far as the moment required, there is something in that refusal that resonates, because most of us at some point have sat in a metaphorical chair while someone with perceived authority told us something about ourselves that wasn't true. Something vague enough to be hard to argue with, something delivered with enough confidence to make us doubt our own experience. Most of us sat still. Tom Hardy stood up, and the world noticed.